I'm Ashton Addison from Event Chain for Investmentpitch Media and FinTech News Network. And today on Blockchain Interviews, we have Charles Hoskinson, the founder and CEO of IOHK and the Cardano blockchain. Charles, thanks so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Ashton, thank you so much for having me on.
You're very welcome. I'm very excited to learn a little bit more about the Cardano blockchain today. We're getting close to 2020, and I know that you guys have some really big plans for the year. If you could start by kicking it off for the audience, what is the 5-year vision from today of the Cardano blockchain?
So Cardano is really kind of the first principles project. So when we started it in 2015, it started almost like a DARPA project where we said everything is aspirational. We're going to look at just science, and we're going to write lots of papers, and we're going to learn a huge amount about the fundamental concepts of cryptocurrency. So we're going to learn what is a ledger, what is a consensus protocol, what is decentralization, what's a smart contract language, all these things where we kind of have an idea because people have built something and released something, but at the end of the day, it's never been rigorously and formally discussed in a scientific setting, in the university setting, and through the peer review process. So much like a DARPA project, we just hired a bunch of scientists and a bunch of engineers, and we spent several years chipping away systematically until eventually we built up this massive corpus of knowledge. And then what we did is we said, okay, let's pick a subset of this knowledge, and then let's take that and go ahead and actually build something that's useful to society. And so in 2017, we started talking about what would a third generation cryptocurrency look like. So the first generation was obviously Bitcoin, and that's all about payments and pushing value from one person to another and proving out some principles like proof of work, for example, can create a cryptocurrency. And that was a big unknown for a long time. Second generation was all about smart contracts. So you're saying you don't just want to be able to just push dumb tokens around. They have to be smart. You want to issue your own money. You want dApps. You want the ability to have a contractual relationship with somebody somewhere in the world and actually put terms and conditions right on the blockchain. Well, what the third generation is all about is saying, we like what Bitcoin's done, we like what Ethereum's done, but we need this to scale to 1 billion people. We need this to be interoperable for all these other financial systems and other blockchains. And finally, it needs to be sustainable, meaning every time we have a disagreement, we can't have a Bitcoin Cash or an Ethereum Classic. We actually have to have in a way decide who pays and who decides and how the systems are going to basically evolve over time. So what the first part of the project was about was basically creating enough capability where we could put that all together into a coherent vision that we felt could satisfy those 3 design requirements: scalability, interoperability, and sustainability. And what 2020 is about is actually turning on all those protocols and then focusing on the commercialization of the technology. So kind of the model would be like Halo, which was a DARPA program that ran from 2003 to 2008. And they said, hey, we're going to do this crazy thing. We're going to build an AI that's kind of like her. It's kind of like an assistant. And it's just going to read all your emails and know everything and be able to help you throughout your life. Well, that's obviously crazy. You can't do that. However, they did learn enough to be able to create from that Siri, which has now led to Cortana and Alexa and all these other personal assistants and so forth. So this is much the same way. We started with big aspirations of how do we build something that's super secure and cryptographically perfect and can scale to 1 billion people. And what you're going to see in 2020 is basically the realization of the closest engineering approximation of what the science has guided us to.
Very interesting, Charles. And I really like that, the third generation is where it goes to the world, right? Because right now we have smart contracts and dApps that people have been working on Ethereum, but there are those scalability issues. And I'm sure you're well aware of, the proof of work versus proof of stake. And I guess that's a really big part of how you guys are going to scale throughout 2020. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Cardano is already running on the proof of stake network and you're looking at relaunching it. Now, how is that going to make a difference, from the scalability that they have on Bitcoin and Ethereum to now scaling to, worldwide?
Right, that's a great question. So when we launched Cardano, the first variant of the protocol Cardano runs is called Ouroboros Classic. And that's what we launched in 2017, a pretty close approximation of it. And we decided to run it in a federated mode, much like how Ripple runs, just because the point was to build up a population, get exchange listings, to actually introduce this project to the world, because we've been working on it for over 2.5 years, but when we launched it, no one had even heard of it. So, it was important we kind of built up a community. And then once you have a community, adherents, ambassadors, exchange listings, you have a sufficient level of people in that ecosystem, then you can flip a switch and actually decentralize the protocol. And so with the Shelley release that's coming out soon, we actually have the incentivized testnet coming out this week, and then Shelley will come out later next year. hopefully in the early part of next year, basically we say, okay, we're no longer going to actually run the consensus nodes or Mergo, IOHK, and Cardano Foundation. Now the community is going to do that. And there's a lot of science behind how that's going to work, and there's a process for how that gradual decentralization works. But here's the point. Basically, the system will naturally get more decentralized over time as the currency becomes more distributed, and that K parameter we came up with gets larger, which means we'll get more and more stake pools. So we'll start at some number, maybe a few hundred, then it'll get to 1,000, then even more and more and more. And then over time, the system will eventually be led by perhaps tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of unique entities. And the way that we've designed the protocol, as you add more entities, you get more capabilities. You get more services, you get more processing power, and so forth. And that's really the hallmark of a scalable protocol. We have plenty of examples of scalable protocols in the ecosystem. For example, BitTorrent, where when you download a very popular movie, you get it really quickly because people produce more than they consume. If you download an unpopular movie, it takes a long time to download it. So that's a really scalable protocol. You gain value as you gain users. So similarly, we tried to design Ouroboros in a way where we had kind of a natural protocol path that could evolve in that direction. So if we get to 1 billion people, it's not like we have 1 billion people consuming resources from one small group. You have 1 billion people who are producing just as much if they consume, if not more. And as a consequence, the protocol can organically scale to that level. And what we're launching soon is kind of the first major milestone there. It has tons of great theory behind it. And then all throughout 2020, we're going to keep launching more and more capabilities, including our scaling solution, which is called Ouroboros Hydro, the Basho release.
That's great. And I like the path that you guys have taken where you started in a more, semi-centralized way so you could control how you're going to build the foundation and then release it to the community. And it seems that with the current popular blockchain networks, it's this trade-off. Everyone always talks about the trade-off between decentralization and scalability. And if you want to scale, it becomes more centralized. So I guess that's the battle that you guys have sort of been fighting for the last few years, is doing it without becoming too centralized.
And I've never really understood that trade-off profile, because at the end of the day, when you add people, you're adding resources to a system. And we have so many examples of where those resources can be productively added. It's just you need better protocols. And so if you're talking about traditional BFT protocols like Paxos or something like that, they're absolutely right. More people equals more problems. But if you're talking about a truly scalable protocol, more people means more resources for everybody, which means you scale faster. So I think that Trilemma is a false one, and it's just an afterthought of a lack of good protocol design. And that's really the advantage of doing the science first, because what you start with are first principles, and you say what's impossible and then what's possible, and then where are the trends going to take us, and how are things evolving. The other thing is that you can always take lots of stuff that traditionally happens on a blockchain and move it off a blockchain, and then get some sort of compressed representation to verify that it was done correctly. So this is what Starkware is trying to do with these, and you see projects like Halo with Zcash, where they have recursive snarks. And basically those are the concepts of inclusive accountability, where you say you have everything you need for everybody to check that the work was done correctly, but the actual processing, the proof generation, all these things are done off chain. And Lightning is much the same way, just using different primitives in that respect. So this whole layer 2 idea is also very promising for scale. So I think the future is going to be a mixture of those two, where you have first a composition of truly scalable protocols, and you get just enough to actually coordinate a really large system with lots of stuff going on. You have effective heterogeneity. That's what stake pools and these things really provide you. And then you have a layer 2 solution like Lightning or Snarks or something like that. And then when you put all these things together, you can definitely get transaction processing equivalent to what Visa sees or MasterCoin sees.
Yeah. And once you have the foundation all laid out and scalable, you're obviously going to want more smart contracts and dApps, decentralized applications built on top of the platform. What does that toolkit look like for developers? Are you guys making it really easy for people to develop applications on Cardano?
So the first problem with smart contracts, and this is something that kind of fell through as we were studying the smart contract model, is that there's really bad marketing that's caused us to chase something that's not really practical. So with Ethereum, they keep saying world computer, world computer, world computer. This is like the mantra. And so what that really tells you is, I want to build Uber. Oh, I have to now build the Ethereum equivalent of Uber. And that means I want to take all my Uber logic and put it on the Ethereum blockchain. And the minute you do it, it's 1,000 times more expensive, 1,000 times slower, you get terrible quality of service and so forth. It just doesn't work for people. And the incentives aren't rightly aligned. So then what you do as a developer is you take lots of your logic that you had on Ethereum and you pull it back into a server. So then you create this hybrid application where you have off-chain and on-chain. And unfortunately, Ethereum was never really designed to make that naturally orchestratable. So you have all these like monkey patch things that have been put on top to try to make that work well. So what we did with Cardano is we said, first and foremost, let's go ahead and view an application as this big thing. And then let's break it down into services. Let's break it down into different chunks. And then we say, okay, certain subsets of this application, we're going to run on a blockchain. Like maybe your identity management, or maybe you're going to issue a token, like a loyalty token or something. And that's what's going to live on the ledger. But then the vast majority of that logic is probably going to live on a node server somewhere on Amazon or something like that. So let's make it easy to wire those two worlds together, the off-chain world and the on-chain world. And let's let you use the tools in the off-chain world that you're familiar with, whether that be JavaScript or Java or C# or whatever have you, because that's your world, and you've already invested lots of money and time and effort learning those tools and techniques and those languages. But then when you're dealing with the on-chain stuff, you basically have DSLs and Plutus is this language to basically be the bridge to connect the two worlds. And then the DSLs are really, like Marlowe, for example, designed to help you interact with things that live on the chain, like assets, for example. And eventually we can create DSLs for identity and supply chains and all kinds of things. And the advantage there is you get provability. So you know it terminates, you know you've correctly written the contract, you can use templates and these types of things. So you can rapidly prototype, you rapidly develop, and you get a very strong guarantee that something like the parity hack or the DAO hack won't happen. So I think that paradigm is quite good. Now, the other advantage the way we've designed things is with this extended UTXO model, it's easy for us to layer on the Ethereum-style accounts model. So if we want to plop down the EVM at some point in Cardano, we could certainly do that if there's a strong market demand for it. And both of those sides of the system would be interoperable with each other. So a Cardano Plutus contract would eventually be able to call an EVM contract and back. So that helps with the interoperability. So you kind of have two different stories. One is push your logic off-chain and put the stuff that really needs to be on-chain, on-chain. And the other side of the story is if you've already built a lot of infrastructure for your dApp on Ethereum, eventually there'll be a path to port that over to Cardano. And then these things will naturally work their way through. But as a final point, it's really important to understand that the things we write for blockchains, generally, they live in a transactional basis. So what does that mean? Well, there are 5 components to that. So usually with a transaction, you have an asset, you have entities involved in the transaction. That can be one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. You have identity, so these people have some sort of notion of identity. Then you have metadata associated with the transaction, so that can be when it happened, where it happened, these types of things, and it lives within a regulatory environment. So no matter what happens, you have to be able to service these things. And you have to have an easy way for handling these things. You have to have an easy way to reason around how a transaction would occur. A great example of why Bitcoin can't work at a global scale is just because it can't do simple things like pull payments, for example, or contingent settlement. And that happens all the time. If you subscribe to something with your credit card, they pull money from your account. Can't do that easily with a Bitcoin-style system. Okay, another example would be contingent settlement. So, for example, you say, I'll accept donations only if you sign the donation deed. So I can't just put an address up there and take money. I have to hide the address until I get confirmation, then provide it to you with a Bitcoin-style system. But with a really well-designed financial system, you actually just automate all this stuff. So you could run an exchange where you just expose all your deposit addresses, and those contingencies are built in for compliance, for example. So a person has to go through know your customer and anti-money laundering, and only after they've done that can they actually send you a transaction. It won't settle until they've done that. So if you see it settle, you know for a fact that they've done that correctly. So this is really where the third generation is going, is thinking around the whole transaction, the contractual side of the transaction, where the identity lives, who are the entities involved, what type of assets are you moving, and those assets will have built-in terms and conditions, like especially for security tokens. And then you're also going to embed metadata and a litany of other things to allow you to comply with FATF requirements or what have you. And really the magic of Cardano is we've thought very carefully about a transaction model that makes this very easy for you to do as a user of the system. Whether you're a retail user, or you just want to send money to Bob and Bob has to pay his taxes, or you're a big business and you want to build in very sophisticated business logic with your transaction, that stack will allow you to do both of those eventually.
Wow, I'm glad that you covered all of those points, because there are a lot of things, just for example, pull payments. There's just so many different things that are still needed to be built into blockchains properly. And I know you always say, but it's early days, right? Even though we're 10 years in, it's still early days. So it sounds like you guys have really thought this through. What would you say is the biggest challenge that you will face in 2020 as you're working on all of these great things?
Well, we have great competitors now moving into 2020. When we started Cardano as a project in 2015, there was really just Ethereum and the Bitcoin and its forks, and there wasn't a lot of rigor in the space. And now we're looking at the Algorands and the Tezoses and the Avalanches and so forth. And all of these are led by great people who are very smart. They have great engineers. They have scientists working for them. There's real science behind it. And there's institutional support as well, where you have governments and VCs and so forth. And so there's going to be a lot of tough competition. And really, it's going to be a combination of who has the best commercialization strategy, and it's going to be a composition of who can move the fastest to be able to capture some of these emerging markets. So we certainly have a strategy, but they have strategies as well, and quite large war chests to pursue them. But at the end of the day, what really excites me the most is it doesn't actually matter who wins, as long as whoever wins has the right principles. We get so competitive in this space and say it's my cryptocurrency or my vision or the highway, but we're all in this together. Our whole point is pushing power to the edges, getting rid of the middlemen, and putting everybody in charge of their own money and their own identity and their own information and so forth. And so our hope is that no matter what happens, at least whoever wins will carry those principles that we have with Cardano. And if that happens, it'll be mission accomplished. The other thing is all of our competitors are open source for the most part. So we learn from each other and we grow from each other. There's this Darwinian evolution to the development of cryptocurrencies where you stand on the shoulders of giants. Ethereum could not have existed without Bitcoin, and we could not have existed with Cardano without Ethereum. The same for Tezos. It could not have existed without Ethereum. These paradigms allowed people the freedom to experiment. And our hope, and one of the big definitions of success in 2020 is, can we leave enough of a weight that people will be able to build great experiences and great commercialization on top of what we've constructed. And if we can achieve that, I think 2020 is going to be a great year for our project.
That's a great way to look at it, Charles. Are you guys looking for any strategic partners or more developers, more team members right now? And if so, how can they reach out and find out more?
Yeah, so the Shelley era is all about decentralization, and the incentivized testnet is really the first massive milestone in achieving that. And then when we launch Shelley, then it's decentralized, huzzah. But then you have to be useful, so you need smart contracts, and that's what the Goguen era is about. And that's been running in parallel with the Shelley era. And we're getting very close to these things merging together. Now, what we're doing is just like when you build the Xbox, you kind of need launch titles. We're working privately with a lot of different great vendors and ideas, and we're batting around to try to have 5 really good, really solid, well thought out use cases with Goguen to launch parallel to Goguen. So, and we're going to try to build that in a very pedagogical way, meaning that we'll have educational materials, tutorials, developer tools, and these things to follow alongside those use cases so that people can kind of be inspired by that. But we've definitely seen a very large amount of excitement and passion and desire to build something on Cardano. If anything, just issue a token on Cardano. People really love us, and they love what we're doing, the vision, the mission. They also like the sense of stability. They know that since we're building this with science and we're building this with formal methods, this protocol is going to be around for quite some time. And the governance features will be turning on. Those features mean that when changes occur, they occur in a very systematic, organized way. So you won't have the rug pulled out from underneath you, a la Bitcoin Cash or Ethereum Classic style, and then suddenly have this big community fight and have to pick a side. So there's definitely a lot of people that are very excited. The Cardano Foundation and Emergo have done a great job as well, just building up infrastructure and partnerships, everything from joining the Digital Identity Foundation to a lot of these blockchain alliances and so forth. And they even have strategic partner people just wake up all day and that's all they do. The one problem is that in our industry, a lot of these partnerships you can form, they're not very valuable at the moment. They're good openers, but they generally are at the prototype or pilot level, and then to actually convert them over to a permanent relationship is problematic. For example, it wasn't too long ago when IBM and Samsung got together and they said, Ethereum is awesome, we're really excited about it, and they did a project called Adept, and now they're doing their own thing. IBM, for example, has Fabric. So just because you can get a relationship or a pilot doesn't mean that that relationship and pilot is going to convert into something that is a permanent relationship with the Bosches and the IBMs and the Microsofts of the world. They're much more inclined to do things in-house. So I think we have to be, as an ecosystem, a bit systematic and a bit careful about expectation management. So what we tend to focus on is first principles and bringing startups and SMEs into the ecosystem, because they don't have preferences and they don't actually have strong desires, and they don't actually have the resources to go build an in-house blockchain solution. So they're much more inclined to just strategically partner and actually carry that to market with whatever business model they happen to have. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in 2020.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Charles. That's all the time that we have on the interview today. I really appreciate you coming on, and all the best in 2020 with moving forward with Cardano. And let's follow up in the near future and see how these releases go. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Cheers.